All right, guys. Welcome to the third part of this SAML training. Today we'll specifically be talking about troubleshooting. So let's just do a little recap. Let's say, right, if we go to Centrify Cloud first and log into Salesforce by clicking on the SAML application that is IDP initiated single sign-on. And that is true for any other application tile that we click on and go to the application. Since we are starting from the IDP side, that's IDP initiated single sign-on. For SP is like an extended version of that. The only difference is the user goes to SP first, and SP redirects the user to IDP, and then the remaining workflow is pretty much the same. Okay, I hope you guys still remember those. And last time I showed you a configuration of SAML between Centrified and Salesforce. I hope many of you have actually tried that. And whether or not you have or have not run into errors, well, that's what this session is about. So when single sign-on fails, which happens quite a bit during integration time, right? And what can we do? More so for support when the customer, either they are using a SAML configured or pre-configured by app template, or they try to use the custom app template and start from scratch, and they try certain things and it didn't work, they call in for help. What can we do? Now let's start with the error that they receive. Unfortunately, every service provider could have different behavior and therefore different messages. But still, we have to first see what they are saying. So some show an error message, kind of like this one from Salesforce, that if you read it, it says, hey, the assertion is invalid. So do something about it. But it doesn't now. You guys have known better what is actually inside the assertion. There are many pieces that we are interested in that we configure. So in this message, this is kind of specific, but not specific enough to pinpoint what exactly went wrong. And I'll tell you that some service provider, they don't even show an error message. They simply put the user back on login screen, and some customer report could come in, and that's exactly what they're observing, and they don't know what happened. In our case, well, we don't really know what happened either, except we only knew that a SAML single sign-on failed. And from SP point of view, I designed some of the design that I know that they say that, well, because SAML single sign-on failed, we put the user back on login screen so they can fall back to use username and password login. So, but that is that individual SP's implementation and design, right? Then the next question is, well, what can we do? There's actually there are tools that will help us to achieve these. But the first thing to do is really just to double check all the configuration values on both ends. So all the things that I have told you in part one, as well as we have done some in part two, all of those have to match on both sides. So when something doesn't happen, the first thing is really just to go through that. And sometimes some people might not receive that too well, that they would say, well, I have double checked it. But really just for formality, we have to do that. And I can show you later how fragile these configuration can be. As in, we are looking for an exact match of given any configuration value. Anything down to even just a slash that doesn't match, then either side can throw an error, and then the whole thing fails. So these terms going to be, you guys should be familiar with these terms by now. So of course, most of the values, pretty much all the values would be on the SAML related. So starting with the ACS URL, And all the pieces in SAML response. The most important one here would be the issuer and signing certificate, as well as some other things. If you use SAML attributes that will be inside the response, relay state if used, it will be showing up. And if this single sign-on we are troubleshooting is SAML initiated single sign-on, then there will also be SAML requests involved. So all these we can actually run a single sign-on being configured and look at the network trace and verify all these pieces. Now, I'll specifically mention account mapping. After all these URLs and issuer certificates being set correctly, this one is actually related to the name ID output. On our side, in our account mapping tab, how the name ID value is generated per configuration, that is very important. Sometimes that after we verified all the SAML configuration, hey, they are good, but it's still not working. And you look at the network trace where everything is good, but there's then the next thing to look at is the values look good, right? But are they actually good when they get to the SP side? So we'll get to see that again later on. Now I'll fast forward to say after you have troubleshoot everything, verified everything, see it in network trace, they all look good. If you're confident that you have with customers that they have done everything correctly, then it's really the time to communicate with service provider. Hey, we follow the information you've given us, either is via documentation or some technical representative, their support department telling us what to set, and we have set all that, it's still not working. Here's the error we are getting. Then just work with them together to figure it out. Documentation, yeah, some documentation describe possible errors and might give the solutions. Some applications are better to even have debug or logging tools on their side in their admin interfaces. So if you have access to that, you could go in there, then it might have logged some more specific reason of why single sign-on failed, which they didn't show on screen, like when error happened, but they actually logged it internally inside their system. Okay, still, let's go through some possible errors. Now, if you get specific error messages, of course, those are the best, right? The best in this scenario that you actually know what happened, such as if SP says certificate error, right? Then immediately that is something with the signing certificate. It always starts with do the signing certificates on both sides match or not? And one little possibilities that a mistake could have happened in between is, say, remember how we download metadata from our SAML application, the trust tab. Now, if you get the metadata is generated from the configured value, right? Signing certificate included. Meaning, if anyone happens to download a metadata before they set the certificate, right? And so they download the metadata, give it to a service provider for configuration, then they change the certificate, then that will result in a mismatch, right? Because the correct order will have to be reconfigure the signing certificate first before we download the metadata and give it to a service provider. Another one is, say, the user does not exist in the application. So that goes right back to the, technically speaking, the name ID value in SAML response. Or a few service provider, instead of name ID, they have the user value put in SAML attributes, then that would be the SAML attribute value we are looking at. But still, the one step back in configuration, right? How that value got into the response, right? That value generation, primarily in account mapping. If after account mapping, there's also like custom logic, aka advanced scripts being set, then we got to look at that too, right? And again, we can use preview button to see the output. But by this point, any network trace captured would also show the value being sent. So you just need to make sure that the generation is generating the correct name ID value that SP can use to map to a user. So far, so good? Okay, I'll take that as a yes. Now, for service provider that supports multiple IDP, they could have an error that says, hey, I don't recognize this IDP, or audience, if audience values don't match. So what that means is, right, they look at the token and they saw the IDP, entity ID, or the audience value, and can't find a matching configuration on their side. So that's the message. Then it's very likely, I say very likely, but all the time, like when that happens, that's exactly what happened was, there is a mismatch, but like you just need to check the values on both sides match. As in, if, right, for IDP entity ID, we give SP this entity ID. Now, could that be in any communication in between, say via email or whatever, and then when they enter that value, copy and paste, or however they did that, it happened to, you know, mismatch just by mistake. That has happened before. And then saying single sign-on failed. Next one, this one is also specific about name ID format. Now, name ID format, I've said that normally it is something that if SP wants you to set it, right, then, well, you set it. You set the exact one that they want. Or if they give you an option, some option, then you decide which one to use within their range. But sometimes a mistake could happen. We forgot to set it, or custom logic happened to set it the wrong way. And when the response gets sent to SP, and that's what they say, they invalid name ID format. So once again, just check what is supposed to be and make sure that the name ID format value being output, being written in SAML response is correct. Now, if you don't have that information yet, right, let's say you contacted SP to ask, hey, I don't know which one is right? Yeah, we should have known by now, but hey, too bad. It is what it is. We send one out now, then SP is rejecting it. What is happening until they respond back? There may be still things you can figure it out. If this single sign-on is SP initiative single sign-on, meaning they will send a SAML request. Inside SAML request, the name ID format may be there. I say maybe because per specifications, it is optional for SP to include name ID format or not in SAML request. If I recall correctly, that is the case. Meaning, if you run a network trace, you see the SAML response, you decode it, you look inside, then there might actually be a name ID format in there, meaning that SP is expecting you to use the same. Okay, so the errors are specific. That's good. What about when it's not? Like the one that I just showed you with the Salesforce, just tell us that there's something inside the assertion that is not right. Well, then it really just could be anything. So we'll have to just check configuration on both sides and rule them out one by one. Same thing with this service provider landed you on the login page, without any message, or with a message that is not specific enough, then that's the same thing. We don't know what exactly went wrong, then we have to just go through configuration more carefully the second time and rule them out one by one. Right, and any information that we are not sure, then we simply ask service provider. Now, the third one is more interesting, and some of you may have seen this, that the SAML single sign-on redirection between service provider and the identity provider are looping. So SP send the user to IDP, centrify, and centrify send the user back to SP, very likely at ACS URL, right? But then SP somehow redirects to centrified again, and this loop just keep going and going. And you can see in the URL in web browser, the URL bar that is going crazy also. If you have network trace open, then you get to see all the entries just keep coming up. And there are usually just two scenarios of doing that. Now imagine the SAML diagram for a second that I showed you in part 1, all right? More so in the SP initiated single sign-on scenario, that they will send the user to our IDP single sign-on URL, and we send the user with a token back at ACS URL. We have seen that due to misconfiguration, if ACS URL happens to, so on our side, right, if on IDP side, we mistakenly set ACS URL to be SP initiated single sign-on URL, that forms a loop right away, right? So first check that, hey, are we setting that correctly? Then if you set it correctly, you confirm that, hey, you have set it correctly and it still happens, then it could be a second scenario, which is on the SP side, for whatever reason, and usually that could happen when single sign-on fails on their side. They want to redirect the user back to login page. However, by their implementation, when SAML is configured, they redirect the user to IDP, right, for authentication. That forms a loop too. Okay, so just recap this scenario one more time. From IDP, clicking on the SAML applications to launch a single sign-on, on SP side, it failed for whatever reason, and it redirects the user back to Centrify. But then the user had already, right, in Centrify to launch that app. So what will immediately happen was the same SAML application get launched again, and then on the SP side it fails again, then that's the loop. So network trace is the best tool here to figure out, to find out the details inside not only the SAML response, but also other parameters such as relay state. And there's actually a target parameter involved that I have not actually talked about that one yet. The target parameter is actually used in SAML 1.0 that we support, but we do not normally use it because, right, we do SAML 2.0 most of the time. But then for service provider that actually still support SAML 1, and they give the target parameter, they take that as precedence, then they will actually process that parameter first, and then things start to go wrong from that point on. So it's really again just to inspect like why the loop is happening, right? Because it's either someone is sending the user to either a wrong location or by some reason doing so. So we need to figure out that part many times with service provider, right? Because they are the best one to tell us why that redirection is happening on their side. And then we resolve that together. Okay, the last one on this table, this is actually a specific error, but it's on our side. As soon as you clicked on a SAML applications or programmatically clicked on it, right? And if you get the error saying subject name is empty or white space, that really means that the name ID value that during SAML response generation, it couldn't find a value per account mapping configuration. So this is actually a valid error that is telling you that, hey, I can't even find a name ID value for this user per account mapping configuration, and therefore I will not be able to write a valid SAML response, and therefore no SAML response will be sent out. So when this happens, go back to the SAML applications, starting with account mapping to see like what configuration is there. And then if you have custom logic, go through that as well. Use the preview button again because the preview button will give you the same error when this happens. So what you need to figure out is, hey, how for this user, for this logged in user, why this configuration is returning an empty string, right? Because without some name ID value, there's no chance to succeed on SP side. It is going to be an error. And for this one specifically, you won't see anything in network trace because SAML response will actually not be sent by this error. Okay, so that's most of the possible errors. Before I go into debug tools to talk about how to capture the trace, most of you probably know already. Let me try to show you how fragile this configuration can be. So this one I have on screen was the one from last week that we configured live. Now, instead of, for the sake of time, instead of showing you, instead of for me to like break it and then go through the exercise of how to troubleshoot it like what I just told you, I'm gonna just show you, hey, this is the correct one. I mean, this is a good one, and then I'll break it. Then you'll see what happens. Okay, so this one still works. I'm gonna log out. And another tip for you is, right, because we'll be logging in and out on IDP side and SP side. I personally use a different browser to do different things. So let's say, okay, so this is the SAML application trust tab. We're using default certificate. So if I change the certificate, then this would be a certificate mismatch. And if you launch it, then there's an error. Okay. Now it doesn't tell you what exactly went wrong. It does say that well, Salesforce has a SAML assertion validator. So it is asking you to go there and figure it out. So that is still a clue. And like the next step, you can try to troubleshoot it. Now let me put this back. And the next piece I showed you, I never saw this until in the trainings a long time ago. Somehow it happened, just so that, right? Hey, it looks like a URL, just .com with a slash at the end seems harmless. Well, it is harmless or not depending on what service provider says. So in this case, really just that one slash can throw the whole thing off. And the error message in this case is still the same. So I hope that if we do go to the SAML assertion validator, it might say something. But just to show you how every little thing can throw the entire thing off. Okay, so just to prove that, I revert those settings. It's good, right? I'm gonna break it again. So if you go through, just look at trust tab, hey, all the configuration are good. Go to SAML response, if all the attributes are set or even custom logic are good, you use the preview button to double check that. And well, guess what? If your user, right? So in this case, it would be, well, I'm using a hard-coded one, so there's no generation here, right? But imagine normally, right, we will use either, hey, we'll get the name ID value from user principal name or SAM account name or some other, or mail, right? If a logged in, if some individual users somehow don't have the mail attribute set, then for those users, the output would be an empty string because they don't have the mail value configured. In this case, just want to show you if in account mapping, the output account mapping is not correct, then it also fails. In this case, it's also the same message. So things like this that, or maybe, well, sure, for me who have done this quite a bit, and these things you can like just see from, troubleshoot from this screen, right? Or the first round of just double checking configuration is just by, you can do that just by looking at it. Even though you use SAML trace, I mean, it's the same value coming out, going down to the token. Right? We have seen that in the XML and network trace. Okay, so speaking of network trace, let's talk about the tools. There are many tools out there that can do that. So a lot of time it really depends on what you already have on hand, or more so if you are troubleshooting with customer what they have on their side, and also if they are willing to install additional tools, then you just have to use what you have. So there are many types of tools too. Nowadays, in pretty much all web browsers, I think that's pretty much safe to say that they already have a built-in tool or developer tool that one of the tabs is to capture network traffic. So we can use that. And this one I mentioned last time at the end of part 2 because someone asked. So I show you a little bit that there's a browser nowadays actually called add-on, Firefox browser add-on called SAML Tracer that has a simpler interface, and that it helps you to pick on SAML traffic, so it's just faster to use it. More so, it also decodes the SAML message for you because the tokens are encoded string down the wire. So the tool decodes it for you, you get all the information right away. So that actually saves a lot of time. So there's all these little times that you need to convert the values to something visible, more readable, it adds up. And of course, Fiddler, we use that a lot, not to also troubleshoot just about every other, any networking problems, right? Someone also mentioned Wireshark a long time ago, which honestly, well, Wireshark is so powerful down to reading network packets. For SAML troubleshooting, that might be a little too heavyweight. And then I throw that line, right? And we'll see this. After extracting the SAML response and request, because it's an encoded string, unless you are using tools like the SAML tracer that does it for you, you will have to bring that to another decoder to do that. There are also a lot of SAML response request decoders on the internet, and yeah, just pick one and go with it. Now, at the time that this slide was first made, which I think was 2 years ago or 3, the consensus between engineering and support was to use the Firefox add-on, the SAML tracer. But of course, that's up to you guys. the only thing on the collaboration side to consider, if you ask me, is the capability to export a trace and import a trace. All right, because that's how, say, in the customer, in an escalation, support captures a trace and be able to export it, and then the next person, either being another support engineer or developer on the engineering side, can simply import the trace and read it. A lot of tools can actually do that now with whatever you choose to use together. Just make sure that part is there. Okay, next I'm going to go through some of them. So I updated this slide. I am using Chrome 73 right now. So all these steps here are for 73, which actually hasn't changed much, if at all, from the previous versions. Long story short, so these are just a list of steps. Long story short is really just to open up the developer tools, go to the network tab. For Chrome, capture starts by itself as soon as it comes up, so you don't need to click capture. Although after capturing, you do need to click on stop capturing not to capture more additional noise. I will point out there's this preserve log checkbox. Sometimes there are pages we have been talking about redirections. So when it redirects, if you don't have the preserve log checked, then all the traces will be gone. So make sure you check that to capture the whole chase. Now for Chrome, there's actually an option to export the trace to a .har or .har file. And if you right-click on any traffic role, then you'll see the option at the bottom to save all as HAR with content. So when you click that, that will download the .har file on disk with the trace you have in the tracer at up to that point. And then what you can do with it is Google has made this HAR analyzer, G Suite toolbox. So here's the link. But honestly, even for me, you either bookmark that or just go to Google, then search for Google HAR, then the HAR analyzer will be your first hit. And you'll see a button that to upload the file, and it will show you the trace you have captured very nicely with a lot of details too. So here I'm including two screenshots. This is the Chrome developer tool in the network tab. So on the left side is really just all the traffic that's going through, because the points of interest for us would be the IDP, single sign-on URL, or ACS URL. And then for the output, you'll see on the right-hand side, if you go to headers, the form data, then you will see the SAML request or SAML response in a encoded string like this. And if relay state is used, then you will see that too. In this case, in the screenshot, it was used, and it was just a slash. Here's another screenshot with the HAR analyzer. But this screen is actually past that point to upload the file. So on this screenshot, the HAR file has been selected, and this is how it opens it up. And it tells you all the timings and things, and it does not actually look a lot different from the developer tool in browsers. But so on this one, what I want to point out is you see this yellow box on the time. So this is the one that I've clicked on, right? And just like other developer tools, then they will show you the details on the right-hand side. So this screen looks very much like just the last one, all right? And if it is response you're looking for, then click on the response tool. But what I want to show you is what the HAR analyzer looks like. So if you use Chrome, then you have this option. Okay, Firefox is another browser that we use pretty much is the same thing, except the locations is slightly different. And once you bring that up in Firefox, instead of preserve, it's called persist. It's at the same location. I don't know if one of them like copied the other or something, but check that checkbox before you launch single sign-on, so you don't lose any trace in between redirections. Now for Salesforce, I personally don't know of any options to export. Very likely just because in Firefox I have the SAML tracer add-on, and if I am in Chrome I have the export to XAR. So even if Firefox does have the similar functionality, I don't need it. I mean, I already have some good options that I always go to. Even IE has developer tools. If IE is the one that you can use, right? Some of you might have dealt with customers that they are so much into using IE and they're so strict into not allowing to install additional tool or additional browser because they are, in their operation, sometimes even production VM or machines. Then IE is the only thing you have. Then IE is the only thing you can use, which is fine. It's once again the same thing. Bring up the network tools. The only thing with IE to pay attention to is, at least for IE 11, is that capture does not start automatically by default, meaning you do have to explicitly click on the capture button before you run a trace. Okay, so now we have seen that encoded SAML response or SAML request string, and it's so long too. Now, how do we read the content? So there are plenty of SAML decoders or encoders out there. Just Google it, you'll see a lot. One of them that looks pretty good is this one I'm showing, SAML token at samltool.io. And what I like about it is it's not only decoded, of course, but also, right, it gives you that indentation and color code, for easy viewing. Okay, now back to the Firefox SAML tracer add-on. And I've shown this last time. Hope you guys remember that. If not, then it's really just similar thing. Bring up the tracer before you run it. And what's good about it is it will recognize the traffic with the SAML messages in it, and it will show you like a big SAML indication next to it. So you, instead of having to eyeball, scroll up and down to find out, right, where your IDP's single sign-on URL is, where the ACS URL is, it tells you it's right there. And more importantly, it decodes the SAML messages for you, so you don't have to copy the string and bring it to another tool to decode it. I somehow didn't have a screenshot here. So let me just put that one in since we're recording this, I can show you this. So this is my other Salesforce test account. Oh, let me choose another one. So you'll see I'm doing this already. That's like before I launch the trace, I clear the capture traffic from before. And here I'm actually launching SP initiated single sign-on. But this is a working scenario. But anyway, what I want to show you is the trace, right? So this SAML tracer, So we started from Salesforce, right? And then, so this is my Salesforce account, TFOF1020, and it does whatever it needs to do on their side. So the point of interest here on the right-hand side, you see these SAML indicator. So this is where it's first find, hey, there's a SAML traffic here. So this is what my Salesforce test account sends information to my IDP single sign-on URL. Right, so here are the parameters with the relay state, just a slash, and this SAML request. So which is this long encoded string. And here's the powerful part. You click on the SAML tab, it decodes it for you. Right, that's why we like it so much. And then further down, okay, so I was in, that was actually my dev environment, and I hadn't logged in yet, right? You saw me logging in, so internally we're directed to log in, and then security, API, all that good stuff. And then at the end of the day, it generates a SAML response to the ACS URL. And the same thing here is it's indicating to me that, hey, you see a SAML traffic here, and if I go to the SAML tab, it decodes the response for me.
Hey, Terry, is it the recommended tools in your experience that this is the easiest way to trace the things, or you have some other better tools?
This is my best tool. I do recommend this one.
Great.
And even more, it does have the export and import button up here. It's a little small, but it's there. So after you run a trace, export it to a file, and then another person can, as long as they also have the same tracer, then they can import that file, then see the same exact trace. Okay, so that's SAML tracer. Okay, so that's it for all the tools I want to show you. I put this together. But this is really for you guys to, like after this session, if you have time, go and read these two. I picked these two because I thought it was pretty good case studies. So these are two real customer case that we did some time ago. And what I want you to pay attention is, when a real world case comes in, things are, a little different. It's not just always like a textbook stuff that I've gone through, even showed, some of the things to you that it might not always be like so clear or clear cut like that. But so I want, when you guys do get to that, what I want you guys to pay attention and take away is, in a real world scenario, how a case comes in, right? More so than customers' wording, right? When they first reach out to support, enter a case in Salesforce, right? And they might be using some different wordings and context, right? Which is okay because that's the observation. But on our part, right, soon enough we'll need to figure out like what exactly like those things mean. So, and what information is being provided up front or not. Customers wouldn't know what, they may not know what will help us to troubleshoot a case. Then we just need to collect those pieces. If they don't have it, then we'll just have to turn around and ask for more. Right, and checking the configuration, like I said, that happens pretty much all the time. And depends on the customers and the situation. You could choose, because I have chosen to either do that via messages or email, or if you get to that point that, hey, you know what, actually seeing their screen, right, to do it together on a live call will be more efficient than do that. And most importantly, the thought process also, after all these 3 parts of training, I've been showing you, the workflow and all the pieces that are so important. So it's really just to narrow down, hey, given them what pieces we have, if we don't have, can we ask for them? And then just try to put together the whole picture and then narrow down to what exactly is the cause of the problem. I'll give you a spoiler for the second one, CSUB 2404. At the end of the day, it really was just a setting in account mapping. After even the title said, right, hey, the issue started with being metadata, and it could be, right? It could, for case could come in as starting with something that they think is not right, and probably something is not right, right? And we try to troubleshoot, and we find out more and more. And eventually, it could be really just down to those little pieces that throws up the whole thing. Okay, so if you have time, go through that. And if you have any questions, of course, just ask me. And I'll try to answer. Even if you have been trying to configure some Salesforce SAML integration that we did in part 2, you can send me a message or email also. But after today's part, like, you should be able to do some troubleshooting first, right? And narrow down what went wrong. Okay, so that's all I have for you guys today. You guys have any questions for me?
That was great. Thank you.
All right. That's good to hear.
Good job, Terry.
Thanks, Terry.